Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Min Sun Hee with our group of foreign journalists. Welcome to the show.
Good to be back, thanks.
"22 days of campaigning have come to an end, and Koreans are now waiting to see who will take the top post. What were your views of the campaigning, Frank?
I thought it was a really interesting campaign. I was particularly impressed by the debates and the influence that the debates actually had on the various candidates' support. We talked about debates in an earlier program, and we had sort of reached the conclusion that debates really didn't have that big impact on the outcome. But I think although the debates might not have had an impact on the outcome of this election, it did have an influence, I think, on the public's support for different candidates and a shift in that support.
Right. What are your thoughts, Elise?
I'm really fascinated by how compressed the schedule was, because I'm an American, I'm used to these presidential races lasting 2 years or so, or what feels like 2 years. So for all of this to happen within the window, this 22-day window as you describe, has been really exciting.
Right. Don, what are some of the immediate tasks that the new leadership will be required to tackle?
Well, I think that we're all more or less familiar with the issues. You know, what do you do about North Korea? What about unemployment, especially youth unemployment? What about poverty among elderly? What about improving the economy? What about labor issues, labor demands, and labor needs? So we're faced with the same raft of issues that we were faced under previous administration. The question is whether or not this incoming administration, this new administration, can deal effectively with them, and we will have to wait and see. We just can't tell, but it's going to be exciting and interesting.
Right. Frank, on the security front, what are some of the issues that the administration will be required to deal with? You
know, as Don mentioned, we're going to be, faced with North Korea and the THAAD issue, and relations with China and relations with the U.S. You know, I think it's a little bit unfortunate that the initial impetus behind this election had to do with corruption and collusion and perhaps a little bit about the economy, whereas the main issue now is a security issue, and it shows how in sort of state politics, national politics, international relations can kind of take away from a government's domestic agenda and trying to improve the lot of its citizens. Certainly THAAD will be a big issue. I was down at Seongju this past week for a demonstration there. You know, the incoming administration is going to have a big challenge there with THAAD already deployed and at least partially operational. Whether that is going to be withdrawn or renegotiated, you know, that's going to be a big issue. And again, how is China going to respond to this? The incoming administration really isn't responsible for the deployment of THAAD. So, you know, and then we have improving relations between the U.S. and China. So how is all that going to play out? I think we'll have to watch the coming months very carefully.
Right. Article 67 of the Constitution reads, "The President shall be elected by universal, equal, direct, and secret ballot by the people." In this edition of Foreign Correspondents, we talk about the most representative act of democracy, voting.
The President is the head of state and represents the country vis-à-vis foreign nations. It's the highest public office in the country elected by the people. When it comes to the birth of democracy and subsequent developments, voting has played a central part. The United States elected its first president, George Washington, in 1789 through 69 electors in an electoral college. Aside from the ancient city-states, it was the first time in history a state leader was voted into power by the public. But it was a long journey ahead until all people were able to exercise equal rights in elections. Women and African Americans were denied the right to vote. After slavery was put to an end in 1865, the black community was able to exercise its voting rights starting in 1870. But it was not until 1965, through the Selma movement led by Martin Luther King, that black voters were able to take part in earnest, having been disenfranchised until then by poll taxes and literacy tests. It was only in 1920 in the US that women's suffrage was achieved. In France, it's only been some 7 decades since women have been able to vote. Over in Korea, in 1972, presidential elections went from being direct to indirect under the Yusin Constitution. And it took a long struggle for the people to win over the right to directly elect their president. June Democratic Uprising in 1987, which swept across the nation, is what eventually returned the presidential election to direct popular vote. The right to vote was never a given. Each ballot held by the public in many ways represents a struggle that unfolded over centuries by countless members of society.
Frank, voting, your thoughts about it, very fundamental thoughts. Is it a duty, is it a right, or is it both?
I think it's a little bit both, but I would say it's more of a right. It's a sort of a subject of embarrassment for myself to say that I haven't voted in every election. And I do view it as something of a responsibility. I think that one of the things that we're lacking in our societies in general, as we've seen, we're going to talk about this, the declining voting rates. I think that there's not enough political participation in our societies, and that places democracy somewhat in peril. And I think voting is one of the stronger ways that you can demonstrate and be politically active and have some control and some say in the governance of your country. Democracy isn't a freebie. It requires some work, and voting is the most basic part of that work that society needs to do to maintain its democracy.
Elise, why then do you suppose people, apart from the reasons we gave earlier, why is it that not a lot of people are voting then?
Well, apathy, for one. It's been interesting watching a lot of American politics, because there's also the sense that your vote doesn't really matter, that, this came up in the Trump-Clinton race a lot, that either way, it would be the same result or a status quo. So there's a lot of cynicism going into things now. There's also the argument, of course, that if you are living in a comfortable democracy and your government is running and there's no sort of runs on banks or food shortages and things like that, that you're so comfortable that you don't feel like you need to politically participate. And so, my mother is Taiwanese, which is a newer democracy, and so they see much higher rates, for example, of political participation, especially when they first started having direct presidential elections, because it was new, and it's because it was something that people had to fight for, right? It was still in their memory that martial law existed. And
I think we saw the same thing in the South Korean elections. Initially, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, they had higher participation rates than they do now.
Yeah, and so, that's a really good parallel. And so, the US, we've been a democracy for hundreds of years, and so arguably that's something that people have gotten really comfortable with.
I see. Don, is the act of abstaining also display of one's right, would you say?
Well, I think people do abstain because they don't like the choices offered, and also the sense that what's the point of voting? I'm not going to change policy just by my little vote, So there is that. One point I should make, I believe, everybody enjoyed a holiday on Election Day here.
Yes.
Election Day is not a holiday in the U.S. You got to go to poll early or get there before they close at 6. Go during your lunch hour, but it's not a holiday. I think it would help a lot if it were a holiday in the U.S. I also happen to think, and many people disagree with me, that maybe there should be a requirement for people to vote. In Australia, they require people to vote. If you don't vote, you're subject to a fine. I do think there's a certain amount of pressure, legal pressure, to go there and cast your ballot might be helpful on a holiday. Take a holiday, go to the poll, and then enjoy the rest of the day off.
Right. Frank, you talked about this earlier, but declining voter turnout is a concern in several countries. And like you said, there are some who believe that this is an upsetting phenomenon, as it has huge implications for the future of democracy. Do you believe politicians are also to blame for the falling voter turnout?
Well, I think there is the apathy maybe is connected to maybe skepticism and disappointment in political leaders. I mean, looking at the earlier debates, we had this program about debates, and the degree of respect that the two candidates paid each other in the early debates, the first, I think, presidential debate where you had Nixon and Kennedy, the degree of respect that the two candidates had for each other in that debate really is completely vanished from the political spectrum now. And the mudslinging, I think, really kind of turns people off the political process quite a bit. But in terms of voting rates, I think that there's a deficit sort of taking place in democratic education, in perhaps even elementary and middle and high schools, and where people aren't learning how to be, there's no courses in civic responsibility in school. You have history and political science and other things, but people aren't learning, you know, that it is perhaps something of a responsibility to vote, or how to pay taxes, things like that, where you're understanding your place in the community and your place in your society and the political connection between those types of behaviors and the government that you have.
Some countries, including Australia, Belgium, and I think Brazil, host a compulsory voting system, Elise, and in some cases people are fined for not voting. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm still in favor, and Don obviously alluded to this already, but I'm still in favor of making it as easy as possible for people to choose to vote on their own. And so something we don't talk about enough with the US is the way that because of the politicians that have already been in office, they've actually created a lot of barriers to voting. This happened with African Americans, with poll testing, with grandfather clauses saying that literacy tests to make it very difficult for minorities to vote. Nowadays, it's becoming more implicit. There's ways to make it difficult to vote by making it harder to early vote, for example. A lot of states are trying to get rid of that. Closing balloting places early, or just reducing the number of them. And the fact that we don't make it easy to register to vote is another problem. So Wisconsin, one US state, offers same-day registration. Other places, like Texas, where I'm from, you have to be registered months in advance. And so making it easier to vote, reducing barriers so that people can when they want to, or can if they decide on the same day of the election to vote, I think would be great. I'm not necessarily in favor of making it, you know, a tax if you don't, or a compulsory choice.
Right, indeed. In Korea, there are celebrities who are known for their vocal views on social issues, and these individuals seek to encourage greater public interest in such affairs.
On April 25th, a public service announcement was rolled out in time for the election. Some 50 top celebrities, including Hallyu stars like Lee Byung-hun, Chung Woo-sung and Ko So-young, took part in the so-called May 9 Rose Project, urging people to cast their ballots in the upcoming election. Some celebrities have used social media to appeal to voters. This public messaging from high-profile public figures is said to hold sway over voters and influence voter turnout. One survey shows that nearly half of the public say they're affected when they see "I voted" photos on social media. Among those who say they're influenced by such images, over half attributed to celebrities and high-profile figures in broadcast media. This drive for voting by celebrities can also be seen in other countries. Back in 2008, Steven Spielberg drew a lot of attention for his PSA on voting ahead of the presidential elections. It starts off with A-list stars such as Will Smith, Harrison Ford, Julia Roberts and Scarlett Johansson being told to say, "Don't vote." But it soon takes a turn, with all the celebrities listing the reasons why people should vote. Driven by public service announcements from leading celebrities, where voters are set to head to the polls to cast their ballots, and they're once again encouraged to think about what weight each vote carries in an election.
There are public campaigns encouraging voter participation amid elections. Are these campaigns, Frank, effective?
Well, I think it depends on the campaign a little bit. I'm very much in favor of campaigns that are bring out the vote campaigns that are not addressed at a particular candidate. I'm a little bit uneasy about celebrities casting their support behind different candidates, and I think it's a little bit unfortunate that the democratic process has kind of devolved into a popularity contest, but at the same time, you know, those people do have their own, you know, freedom to do what they want and to support the candidate they want, and let the chips fall where they may, so to speak, like come out as strongly as they can for the candidate they want to win. They can have a tremendous influence, as we've seen in some American election. Charlton Heston, he reportedly was instrumental in getting George W. Bush elected, and then more recently, Oprah Winfrey apparently was quite influential in encouraging people to vote for Barack Obama.
Right. Elise, what about you? Do you think when these celebrities openly endorse a certain candidate, does that affect voter sentiment? I'm
skeptical about that, just because we've looked at all sorts of different endorsements, not just celebrity endorsements, but endorsements by other politicians. And so, you know, like for example, if John Edwards got out of the Democratic race in 2008 and then threw his support behind Barack Obama, whether that would make that much of a difference. And you know, there's always a lot of excessive media attention placed on this because Jay-Z and Beyonce are stars, you know, but I don't think the fact that Jay-Z and Beyonce supported Hillary Clinton really made a hill of beans in the end.
In Korea, there are firms that offer special discounts and other fun event opportunities for those who vote, provided, of course, that they can prove that they did indeed cast their ballot. Are there similar initiatives in America?
I don't know of any. You know, it's an interesting question. By the way, I think it's a good idea. I think it's great. If that gets people to vote, sure. It also brings some publicity to the store or the shop or the restaurant that gives the discounts, and it does provide incentives. So I think it's a wonderful idea.
Right. In Korea, one has to be 19 in order to be able to vote, and accordingly, some have claimed that the legal voting age should be lowered to 18. Now, I understand it's 16 for Austria and Argentina. What do you suppose would be the impact of a younger voting age?
Well, I'm not sure that 1 year lower is going to have that much impact. You know, I don't think it'd be a bad idea to make it 18. Why not? If you're going to make it 19, why not make it 18? If you want to make it 16, that's something to consider too. I wouldn't have thought that 16 would be the best beginning voting age, but that might be up for consideration. People might want to debate that point, and I'd certainly be interested in following that debate.
Frank, in Korea, in order for you to run for the top office, you need to be 40 years of age at least. How do you respond to the idea of lowering that age to correspond to the age of 18 to vote?
I absolutely agree with it, that it should correspond with the age of 18 to vote. You know, there's a famous phrase, don't trust anybody over 40, so I think that you have to be untrustworthy in order to perhaps run for office. I don't think that we're going to see a parade of teenage presidents if you lower the age that a candidate could run to 18. We've seen some more youthful presidents of various countries come along, though, and I think that's a good trend. One of the troubling things that we've seen is really quite elderly state leaders that we're sort of a little bit out of touch with young people and some of the issues that were affecting them. So I think, at least having that symbolic age limit, provided and enabled would be a good thing, and it would send a message to youth, I think, and might make them feel like they have a little bit more political agency and feel more motivated to vote.
Here in Korea, voter turnout is higher among the middle-aged and senior voters than among the young adults. Is it the same in Canada?
I'm not sure. I think so. I think you'd probably find the same trend sort of internationally.
Why do you suppose this is so then?
You know, I think young people have a lot of other things on their mind, you know, and myself, I'm not sure about our panel today. I became more interested in politics as I got a little bit older, and I had a few more dailies under my belt. I'd read the paper and was a little bit more knowledgeable, I guess, about political affairs. And I think, again, young people have a lot of other issues that are more important to them. Their own sort of private lives and entertainment is more interesting and important to them than politics.
Well, the explanation typically for why older voters tend to show up more reliably is because their lives are more touched by policy, or they feel like their lives are more directly touched by policy. For example, if you're 18 years old and you're eligible to vote, you might not actually be paying taxes because your parents are doing that for you. You might not necessarily be responsible for your health care because you're a dependent of your parents. And so when you can actually see the direct impact of policy, for example, if you're a parent and you are influenced by public education because your children are going to public schools, that might then make you more politically interested.
Okay, a few words of thought before we end the program. Elise, what is one of the fundamental importance of voting?
Well, to have your say in a democracy is the reason why we vote. If you don't vote, you can't complain about it, is the mantra that you often hear. And so I hope that many Koreans participated in this particular snap election, and that, you know, it helps chart the course of the next few years to come.
Right. What about you, Don?
Well, I think it's really important to be able to vote. You know, there really are differences between dictatorships and democracies. There really is something to be said for electing not only your president and so forth, but electing your local representatives, your city council, state level and governors and so forth. I think that, you know, it's very important that we maintain that freedom to vote and that right to vote.
Frank, before we go, how do you assess today's discussion on voting?
I think it was really interesting to talk about this issue, especially you know, some of the points that were brought up about the idea of some type of fine if you didn't vote. I thought that was particularly interesting, and governments might want to find creative ways to encourage people to vote, perhaps some type of a tax break or some type of voucher if you could verify that you voted, or some, you know, department store promotion for people that voted. There might be some other interesting ways that we can ensure people vote, but I think the most important one is getting out a little bit more education and more sort of public awareness of the importance of voting. As Don mentioned, you know, maybe in our democratic societies we've been sort of in this position, the Western world, you know, and as well a growing number of countries over the last 50 years now have democracies, and maybe we forget about how things were before that.
Right, Frank. The power of a single vote cannot be denied, and there are events in history that stand as proof of this belief. In 1868, American President Andrew Johnson came within one vote of being convicted and removed from office. Thank you for watching.